Chuck Adler from Mayo Clinic in Scottsdale, Arizona. Today is June 5th, 2017, and we are here at the 21st International Parkinson and Movement Disorder Society Congress in Vancouver. It's a real pleasure and an honor for me to be sitting next to my friend and my mentor, Howard Hurtig. Dr. Hurtig is now Elliott Professor of Neurology Emeritus at Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania, and he was the chair of neurology at Graduate Hospital when I did my neurology residency at Penn, and I became his and Matt Stern's first fellow. So that was back in 1990. So we've been friends, and he's been my mentor for many years. So thank you for joining me here.
Always a pleasure to be with you, and my honor as well.
So today I have a number of different questions that I'm going to ask about your own history, personal history, as well as history with the society and your career. I think to start off, just can you tell us a little bit about your early years, including your education?
So I was born in a little town in Mississippi, which is a big surprise to a lot of people who hear my accent or lack of. And I went to, I graduated high school in Leland, Mississippi, went off to college at Tulane University, and stayed on to do medical school.
At Tulane.
And then I fell in love with the woman I later married, who at the time was living in New York, and I was in New Orleans. So we decided that I would do my training in New York so we could be together.
And where had you met her in
We had a blind date, Mardi Gras of 1965, to give you sort of a scope of where, how old I am now. And so we started dating long distance, and then we decided there was enough of that. So we actually got married before my internship, which was at Cornell, New York Hospital. And I moved to New York and spent 2 years doing internal medicine. Got interested in neurology there. Fred Plum was the chair of neurology. Jerry Posner was his sidekick. And they both inspired me. And there were a lot of really good people in that department who I liked a lot.
So just going back for a second, how small of a town? You said a small town.
Well, there were about 5,000 people. And in those days, still really, but in those days particularly, the South was totally segregated racially. So about 80% of the population in that little town was African American. 20% was Caucasian, so that means about 1,000 people that I knew and associated with. Because the lines were drawn pretty strictly, I only knew the black people in the town, those that worked for my father in the cleaning business, and some others, but there was no mixing at all.
Right.
And as I look back on that, that was one of the things that led me to sort of be ashamed of where I grew up because of what I naturally was born into.
Right.
You know, you subscribe to the mores of the system that you lived in. I later, of course, made the conversion in my life to look at the world differently. And
then you said you went to Tulane. Was it with the idea of going into medicine? Was there somebody? So who in your young years? You said your dad had a cleaning business. So who in your young years inspired you at that time to become a doctor?
I don't have a really strict memory of that, but I remember that when one of the people who worked in my father's cleaning business asked me what I was going to do when I grew up. I was about 6 years old, and I said, I'm going to be a doctor. And my parents had given me one of these doctor bags that kids carry around. And this is totally apocryphal, probably, but that's what sticks in my mind. And so the employee of my father's kept calling, every time I would show up in his cleaning plant, he would call me Doc. And it stuck, whatever, if that's true or not, I don't know.
And then
But my parents, of course, were encouraging me to do something more than they were doing. 'Cause,
Right.
having a small business in a small town, wasn't something that I was going to return to. Right.
And then you moved to Tulane, majored in
English.
English. So again, nothing to do with science or pre-med.
Well, I was advised that in medical school you get enough of that. Unlike you, who got a PhD. The English department at Tulane was very strong, and I liked to read books. So that was the reason, and that was a good decision.
And then you said, so you went from Tulane up to New York to Cornell.
I did 3 years at Tulane. One of the 4 years I was in college, I was in London. Tulane was one of the schools that early on had a junior year abroad program. So I did my junior year in University College London.
Years abroad were pretty rare back then?
Yeah. I was a little reluctant to go because I didn't want to miss fraternity life.
Right.
But my mother prevailed, and I did, and it was one of the best decisions I've ever made.
Had she used to travel a lot, or she
No.
thought it would be great for
She
her
was
son to do that?
She was a good mother.
Right.
And she had been to school in New Orleans at Newcomb, which was the women's division of Tulane at the time.
So Tulane was an all-male school
So
at that time?
Tulane University had I can't remember how they termed it, but there was Newcomb College, which was for women, but men could take courses there, and
Right.
women could take courses at Tulane. It was just a relic of the past.
Right.
But things were changing in those days.
When you moved up to New York, big change? I mean, New Orleans is
Well, I
a
had
somewhat big city. But
I'd spent a year in London,
Mhm.
so I became much more worldly.
Right.
You know, I met people from all over the world, so that was when it was a major transformation in my view of things and how societies function.
And in med school, anything hit you? You said Dr. Plum and Posner, they had an influence back then?
In retrospect, there was a woman who was the only member of the neurology department, and she gave the best lectures on the nervous system. And I still have the notes that I took
Really?
in that course because she was so clear. I mean, it was a good example, I think, for me and for everybody to speak clearly and not obfuscate. So that sort of maybe stimulated a little bit. I knew I didn't want to be a surgeon, and I did. When I went to New York Hospital, I didn't have in mind that I was going into neurology. I was going to do internal medicine.
So after medical school, you left Cornell and moved to New York Hospital?
No, I left Tulane.
Went to New York Hospital?
Went to New York Hospital.
Okay.
Spent 2 years there
Right.
in medicine, and that's when I decided I was going to become a neurologist. But I had an interlude in Atlanta because it was during the Vietnam War, and I was lucky enough to get out, not go into the Army,
Right.
and I got into the Public Health Service, and I was assigned to work in a stroke program at the CDC.
Okay.
And when I was in Atlanta, Atlanta had a pretty good neurology department. So I used to go to conferences, and there was a man named Herb Karp, who was the chair of neurology there, who became a good friend, and he further inspired me.
So, because I remember when I was a resident, you loved stroke. That was one of your favorite topics to talk about.
I had done the 2 years in Atlanta in the stroke program. And then when I went to Penn to interview for neurology, the assumption would be that I was going to then, I was hoping that I might join the faculty and be a stroke person, which is what I did actually.
And then so where did movement disorders come in? You joined, you were going to be a stroke doc.
Right.
You
I did.
love stroke. Again, I remember even as a neuroresident, that was something you loved looking at scans. You loved finding where the lesion was. That was one of your favorites.
So Bud Rowland was my chair and my boss, And he left Penn at the end of my residency to go to Columbia to become chair there. And the last thing he did before he left was to offer me a job, which was a bittersweet thing because I really wanted to work with him and be in his department. And he abandoned me and other junior people so we forgave him. But it was an interesting time. So when Bud left, Stan Fahn was on the faculty at Penn. And Stan had built up a big practice of people with Parkinson's because L-DOPA, even though the first clinical trials of L-DOPA were in the late 60s, it was approved by the FDA, I think, in 1969. And I arrived there in 1970, and the hospital was filling up with patients.
So you used to admit patients with Parkinson's disease at that time?
Severely disabled people.
Okay.
You know, you've seen the movies, right? Of the people who
Absolutely.
are flat out. It's sort of like in Awakening, that movie that showed the complete transformation of people from essentially bedbound to playing volleyball.
Right.
So the people would come in the hospital, they would get started on levodopa. This was before the days when there was a decarboxylase inhibitor. So they would get these tiny doses, build way up to like 6,000 milligrams of levodopa. And
it's hard to
then
believe.
They would all, not all, but many of them got better, would get up, walk around.
Right.
And there was a wonderful practitioner who was on the, I guess, the clinical faculty at the time named Gabe Schwartz. I don't know, it was before your time. Gabe had been at Penn for a long time, and before Milton Shai came in the early 60s, which changed Penn from being sort of a backwoods, really disorganized department to one that had come into the modern era. So Milton Shai, who was a muscle expert, came in the early 60s, stayed until 1967 when he was offered the job and took the job to become chair at Columbia. So Bud had been at Columbia. He came to Penn because Bud wanted to be chair at Columbia but didn't get the offer.
They gave that to Shai.
So he came to Penn as sort of his second choice. And he started to build on what Milton Shai had done. And it was really an odd coincidental tragedy that Milton Shai was at Columbia for about 3 weeks and dropped dead of a heart attack. And so I think Bud, who had just gotten to Penn, probably was starting to think ahead.
Right.
Anyway, Gabe was just a wonderful human being and had this big practice of Parkinson patients. So he and Stan were doing a lot of that work. So when Stan left to go, I was planning to leave to go to New York, back to Columbia where he had trained to be with Bud. He came to me, he says, you know, I have all these Parkinson patients, so would you like to take them on? So I had just joined the faculty, and you know how it is when you're a young faculty, you don't want to be idle. You want to be as busy, way busy than you need to be.
And needed.
So I was doing, I joined to be Martin Rivich's stroke person. Martin Rivich was the head of the stroke program. And so I was starting to do that. I had taken over Stan's practice. Gabe was a great friend and sort of an idol. And so together we started taking care of all the people with Parkinson. So when people ask me whether I ever did a fellowship, my answer is it was about a 30-minute fellowship. It was a conversation with Stan Fahn about taking over his practice.
And and in terms of staying with Parkinson's, at what point did movement disorders become more than Parkinson's in terms of your practice? And
so I joined the faculty, to be precise, in 1973.
Okay.
That was when Stan and Roland and several others left to go back to Columbia. And so I was seeing all the patients, doing the work in this drug program, and I was trying to make all of it work, and it was getting more and more difficult. And in 1981, this was now 8 years later, I was sort of feeling like I was in a rut. And Art Asbury, who was chair of neurology after Roland left, told me that there was an opening to become chair of neurology at the graduate hospital because the previous chair had been fired. He will be nameless.
Okay.
And you know who it is, I'm sure. So I jumped on that opportunity and moved over there. And Matt Stern was a senior resident going into his senior year.
Right.
And he was planning to take a job at Duke to do...
Which is where he
had been
gone.
in medical school.
Yeah.
And he came to Penn for his residency. And was going to go back to Duke to be a research faculty. And he had, I think, spent some time at the NIH and got interested in a summer job, maybe interested in Parkinson's disease. So he came to me when he had heard that I was making this move. He says, all things are off. I want to stay in Philadelphia. I want to work with you, me, and we're going to build a program. So he finished his residency. I became chair of this department at Graduate, and to make you understand that that was not such a big job. I was a department of one. So for 1 year, I did all the consults, so all the patients, and I liked it because it was energizing, and
still needed things to do.
It was also a change that I really loved because I realized in retrospect that I needed that change. So Matt then joined me the following year.
And you were the only two neurologists at that point at
There was
Graduate
one other
Hospital.
neurologist who devoted all of his time to epilepsy, and he refused to see general neurology patients.
Okay.
So that's the reason I had to do all
Step
of it
up.
in addition. So Matt joins. This was in 1982. We decided, I think it was Matt's idea, let's start a movement disorder center. I'd gotten a grant from the American Parkinson's Disease Association to set up what was called at the time an information center for Parkinson's. And around the time that I made the move, which was a year before Matt joined me, I hired a nurse named Gwen Melvin, now Vernon. And that was also one of the great decisions I'd made.
Yes, that
because
was.
Gwen turned out to be, and still is, now 36 years later, a member of our team. So the three of us organized the Movement Disorder Center at Graduate Hospital.
And was it more than Parkinson's back then, or mainly Parkinson's?
Well, as you know, most of movement disorders is Parkinson's, but we were seeing whoever came in the door. And the word got out, since there were very few people in town doing it except as part of general practice. We were specializing, and more and more people started to come. And people at Penn who had been seeing Parkinson patients started referring to us. And so we became the movement disorders program for the University of Pennsylvania, even though we were at a separate hospital.
Okay.
And to this day, we are still functioning at a separate hospital from the main mothership of the university.
Right. You're currently at Pennsylvania Hospital.
Pennsylvania Hospital, which we made the move in 1997.
Right.
Yeah.
And in terms of clinical trials, first clinical trial you did?
The first one was not so much a trial, it was an open label testing of Pergolide. Which was a dopamine agonist. It may have been bromocriptine before that. I can't remember. So we had compassionate use of a drug that had not been approved by the FDA.
Right.
And one thing that I remember, in one single patient, the N of 1 is sometimes very instructive. It was a man who had been on bromocriptine and had fluctuations, and the bromocriptine had helped, but it was starting to lose its effect, and he came into the hospital to start pergolide. And I still remember how he made this incredible change from being really disabled on levodopa and bromocriptine to being on levodopa and pergolide, and all of his symptoms cleared up.
Everything.
And I've never understood that, and but something that I remember vividly.
In terms of contribution.
Let me finish.
Absolutely.
The rest of the answer to your question. So then, at some point after that, I think before you came to do your fellowship, we started getting in touch with drug companies to do clinical trials. There weren't many drugs that were out there.
You were a data top center. I remember when I came, by that time you were a data top center.
So the Parkinson study group had formed 4 or 5 years later, Ira Schulzen and Stan.
Late 80s.
And we were invited to join, along with a number of other places that had started developing movement disorder centers. So as you remember, it was maybe 30 centers in U.S. and North America, mainly Canada, United States.
Right.
And that's when we really got into the clinical trials business.
In terms of contributions that you feel you've made, things that stand out as major contributions?
Yeah, I knew you were going to ask me that question, and it's an important one because, you know, you get to a certain stage in your career, you say, what have I done? Have I been any good?
Right.
Or
have I made a difference?
And am I an imposter? I think that the main contribution I can point to is training people. Taking good care of patients, training people, you know, the so-called three-legged stool of education, clinical practice, and research. And the research side of it, I think, happened because I developed this collaboration with John Trojanowski and Virginia Lee, and you remember that well.
Yep,
right?
They funded my fellowship.
Right. And they were sort of world-class basic scientists. John was a pathologist and a physician with a PhD. Virginia was a PhD in biochemistry, and they were married. And together, total powerhouse of looking for basic causes of neurodegenerative diseases, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, whatever. So we formed this collaboration, and one of the goals on my side was to provide brain tissue from our patients who were dying of these diseases. So we had a big population of patients, and we started asking for permission to do autopsies, and people were very willing. That was something I learned, that all you have to do is ask. And
the ultimate gift.
And as you know from your own experience of building a program in Arizona, it's just a true goldmine of information and potential for understanding the basis for these diseases. Now, as far as whether I have personally made contributions aside from the work that we've done as a team, I would say it's all been teamwork, right? Which I value highly. But
not even a question.
And as a place to do that kind of collaborative research, Penn is a great place, and I'm sure you would agree that what you've done in Arizona is similar. Working
all
with
teamwork, I agree completely.
Right. So I should also put into this conversation that you were the first fellow in 1990.
Correct.
And we had never had experience with fellowship. And I still remember.
And there was an insistence on doing a fellowship at that point in time.
And I still remember the chagrin when I told you I was going on sabbatical.
Yes.
And you didn't. I had forgotten to tell you that when you signed up for the
You never told me that. It was your wife who told me that. at a barbecue at your house in June of 1990.
Right. And you had already said you were going to come to do a fellowship with Matt and me, and suddenly you find out that
Yes,
There was this big surprise.
This is about you, not me, so I will not comment any further on that.
But you got over it.
I did get over it, I think. So since education really has been one of the key issues for you, what advice do you have for young docs, young scientists now, young movement disorder specialists now? And how have you seen that sort of change? So I was your first fellow, it's 26, we said 26, 27 years ago. How have you seen that change, and any advice you would have for those coming up now?
So when you came along, you had a background in neuropharmacology, so it was a natural for you to head in the direction of movement disorders. There weren't, you correct me if I'm wrong, but there probably weren't very many training opportunities to do fellowships because they
Correct.
didn't exist.
No,
And then
10
the,
or 12, I think,
the
at
field of movement disorders has really mushroomed over the last 27 years. And more people are doing it, as witnessed by the fact that the Movement Disorder Society has now, 6,000 members?
6,200, yep.
And there are a lot of young people who come to these meetings looking to be inspired, also looking for jobs. It's become much more competitive, and if your goal is to do research, it's much harder to get money to support research. And a lot of the programs, the really top programs that train people, are filling up with faculty, or fellows that become faculty. So it's just a lot harder than in the time all those years ago. But, you know, people have to go with their passion. And what I see in the new generation is they really want to take on this kind of career, and they're willing to hustle. And those who don't might initially feel the energy to do it, but then there are those who decide this is not for them. We have one good example is a wonderful young woman who came to Penn for her neurology residency, got interested in movement disorders and the cognitive aspects, and she was joined the faculty. She was great, and she realized that it was just too much. She cared too much about her patients, and she was spending more and more time with individual patients who were cognitively impaired.
Right.
And she was getting backed up, and then along came electronic medical records, and she decided to switch and become a psychotherapist. And one of the things that she's doing now after her training in psychotherapy is to see patients with movement disorders, not exclusively, but she finds that her experience as a member of the faculty in neurology and movement disorders is a great help to her in getting people to learn to live with chronic disease.
I have a question about the past and a question about the future. I'll go past first. If you were to wind the clock back 20 years, 25, 30 years, would there be something you would do differently?
You know, people always ask me that question, and I think it's sort of a dumb question because you take advantage of opportunity. You can't do it.
Right.
You know, I wouldn't have predicted anything that I've done in my career going all the way back. You know, medical school was sort of on my path, but beyond that, it's just finding opportunity or falling into something. I mean, a good example is moving to graduate hospital.
Right.
You know, if I'd stayed at HUP, Hospital University of Pennsylvania, and turned down that opportunity because it was a little scary to make a big
To be a department of one, yeah, I would think so.
Matt Stern would have gone to Duke.
Right.
I would have probably continued to try to do both stroke and movement disorders and fizzle out and lose interest.
And from a future standpoint, where do you think the field's going, and how soon can we get to where you would like it to go?
So how to answer that question? I'm a subjective optimist and an objective pessimist.
Okay.
And you know, I think it's great that a lot of research is going on, but we haven't made much progress in understanding. I mean, we've become good at describing things.
Mm-hmm.
Have we made any progress in understanding the cause of, say, Parkinson's disease? I mean, the genetic discoveries are important.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to hopefully lead somewhere. And I think it's like, where's the world going?
Mm-hmm.
Is climate change going to do us all in and make it all? So, if I can offer you a funny story
Mm-hmm.
From a Woody Allen movie.
Okay.
So Woody Allen, whose movies I love, and maybe you do too,
Yep.
was in one of his movies, I can't remember which one, his parents were trying to get him to do his homework, and he kept sloughing off, and they said, "You've got to do your homework or else," he says, "you know, the sun is going to explode in 1 billion years, so what's the point?" you can take that approach, but
Right.
which I don't. But I think in the future, you know, consider where we've come from.
Mm-hmm.
I think we've made a lot of progress just in the sort of less critical things like training people and
Mm-hmm.
taking better care of our patients and having more drugs available. But whether we're going to, in, say, your lifetime, solve the
Cure
ultimate
Parkinson's.
problem,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know.
I've always admired your ability to have an outstanding, what I would consider an outstanding work-life balance. You've always done a great job with it. How have you done it? What can you tell us what you've done to maintain that?
Well, you have to marry the right person who's going to make it happen. You know that.
Mm-hmm. I do.
And
Really
if I can make an estimate of your life, you've probably figured it out also. I know, and we both know, a lot of people whose everything in their life is focused around their work,
Mm-hmm.
and they ignore their families. And unfortunately for those people, their spouse or significant other hasn't made demands,
Mm-hmm.
and their children grow up to regret it. But I'm not saying that only because I had married the right person that it happened. I always had an interest in something other than what I did at work.
So main interests other than what you did at work? I know some of them, but...
Yeah, well, I try to be an athlete,
Mm-hmm.
and that takes time to
Which
be outside the
sport?
office. So tennis and
Tennis.
bicycling were the two ones.
We used to play basketball
and
in
basketball.
the Graduate Hospital
Yes, that's
Basketball
right.
League, so I
Right, but
don't want to forget that.
That was sort of work related because we played at the hospital. Those were good, fun times.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I think based on my experience living in London and being aware of what's going on in the world, I was always curious about keeping up.
Mm-hmm.
And family life, my wife went back to work around the same time that I took the new job at Graduate. So she told me, she says, "I'm going back to work. You're now in charge of the kitchen, and you're going to do the cooking."
Wow.
So I said, "That's terrific." So I started becoming a chef at home,
Mm-hmm.
and it made me realize I had those responsibilities.
Right.
And I love my children. I wanted them to I had the awareness and the love of taking care of them,
Yep.
and sharing that responsibility.
So I guess the last question would be about the movement.
You mean this
disorder
is almost
society.
over?
Well, it is, believe it
For
or
the second
not. Yeah, by saying that we did this previously, and unfortunately the tape was lost. So I'm happy to be doing this again.
Right.
Role of the movement disorder society, as you see it, how has that been helpful to the field? Where do you think that might be going?
Yeah, it seems to me it's been pretty vital. Otherwise, you don't have an organization.
Mm-hmm.
I guess Stan and David Marsden had started it. Wow, was that in the mid-90s? When
Yeah,
was it?
they
Before?
just said no, they just said a history. Yeah, the late '80s. It
Right.
was when they first
Right.
started coming up with the idea, with it really starting in 1990
Mhm.
or so.
And I remember the early days when Stan and David used to carry on together. You know,
Mhm.
David was a different personality. Stan
Mhm.
was serious. David was a fun-loving guy who was also brilliant and a great leader. So together, that complement
Mhm.
of the two of them made everyone really see that as a wonderful way to go. Then David tragically died. That was a big blow, I think, to all of
Absolutely.
us. I still remember Stan breaking up emotionally when he
Mhm.
had to talk about that, and as the rest of us did. But the fact that it's grown so much, and people from all over the world are members, 6,000 strong,
Mhm.
shows how important it is to have a focus. And I've been very pleased that my partner for all these years, Matt Stern, became president of
Mhm.
the organization. So
It's
that
incredible that you two stayed together for that long.
Well,
Meaning
it's-
both of your his entire
it was a
career.
good marriage.
It was a very good marriage.
Right. And I think, as I said the last time we talked, Matt was always Mr. Outside,
Mhm.
and I was Mr. Inside.
Mhm.
And I kept the ship going at home, and we did our best to not compete with each other,
Right.
because that was a potential threat
Mhm.
to the partnership. And then he went off in his direction, and the program stayed strong because not only because of the two of us as leaders, but Gwen Vernon,
Right.
as a nurse, I think was a role model for nurses who came along, who got interested in
She
moving.
continues to be.
And she
Yeah.
does nursing education now, still has a lot of energy, and it's great. So the three of us together, I think, created something, if not unique, it was just
Very
a
special.
wonderful, special thing.
Well, I thank you. I'm not sure if there's anything else you want to mention about your career or your history that I didn't touch on.
Well, if this interview fails, let's do it again.
Absolutely.
Okay?
Thank you very much. It was a real pleasure.
All right.